Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast. My name is Joey Schultz and I'm joined as always by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, he doesn't play with any of those new Cleave cards because he's too busy playing with Ember Cleave. That's Matt Morgan.
Joe, I went to a magic show over this past weekend and it was pretty entertaining. The audience loved everything, especially the act where they sawed people in half, but the volunteers were kind of divided.
Oh, goodness. Well, I've got nothing to say about that except abracadabra, Matt.
I'm glad you thought that joke was a real side splitter.
This is too much.
You can tell me to cut it out. That's fine.
I've got dad jokes from you, I get dad jokes from my husband, and I'm about to get dad jokes from our next co-host as well. Up next, in the great tradition of Megamorph, he actually can't wait for Cleave to become Mega Cleave, where all of the words in the card get redacted. It's Dana Roach. Hey, bud.
In the honor of the first snowfall of the year here, I need to ask you, Joey, what did the first snowman say to the second snowman?
I dread to know, Dana. What's going on?
Do you smell carrots?
You guys are silly. I'm so happy that you guys do a show with me.
Okay, we're the ones telling dad jokes, but you're busting out the S word.
Silly. Oh my goodness. Anyway, this is the EDHRECast. EDHREC is the best deck building resource on the web for the Commander format, compiling data from deck lists all over the internet to provide helpful recommendations for new Commander decks. And here on the podcast, what we'd like to do is give all of that data a little more context. Matt, what is it that we're talking about in this week's episode?
So this week, we're going to talk about all the new commanders that have been released in the past, however many sets there have been in the past 20 minutes, I would say. But just how do you handle all that overload? There's a lot of information out there and it's hard to weed through sometimes. So how do we handle navigating that field?
Yeah, how do we handle product overload? How do players handle product overload? What can the data on EDHREC tell us about the ways that players spend creative capital? It should be really, really interesting to look through all of the numbers here. Real quick, before we get launched into our main episode, let's pause and give a huge thank you to the folks at the Command Zone podcast who handle the post-production work on our podcast here, making it look as spiffy as it does. And of course, we want to thank our sponsors for the show too.
The EDHRECast is sponsored by Card Kingdom and a TCG player, the snowmen, both frosty and abominable of the snowman world. Just head over to EDHREC and click on the card in question. You'll be able to choose the vendor link down below, and doing that supports both the site and the show.
And if you'd prefer to support the show directly, you can do so over at patreon.com/EDHRECast. We have patron tiers of all sorts of levels for whatever you want to do, and you just support the show and just get yourself a little extra perk on the side, whether it's joining our Discord community, whether it's getting some swag that we send out. We're getting ready to send out our Christmassy end of the year swag, just some awesome gifts, just thanking folks for subscribing and supporting the show. It's just a great way to reward yourself for supporting the show at the same time. We even have a very, very special tier where we shout out somebody just for supporting us because like I said, we appreciate it. So Nick Farino, thank you so much for your support. You're getting that very special shout out. It's a coveted spot and you just happen to have earned it this week.
Thank you so much for your support, Nick. We super appreciate it. And now, fellas, we're going to get into our main topic here, where we're talking about how players seem to be handling product overload and what players seem to be spending creative capital on, which is a term that we've used in prior episodes, but is probably worth a refresher. So, Matt, do you want to really quickly run us through, to your mind, what the idea of creative capital is when it comes to player retention and deck building and all of that nonsense?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like Joey said, we've brought this term up a few times that's kind of been growing in use. But when we say creative capital, we mean players all around the world. They only have so much time or effort or money, especially, to be building decks. You don't have the time to be brewing a deck for every single commander out there. And so any of those resources that you put into creating a new deck, that's kind of what we mean as your creative capital. You only have so much of XYZ resource out there to be putting into this game. And so what is your creative capital? How much are you able to invest into any given commanders? That's what we mean by that.
Yeah, very, very difficult to build 6 commanders from a single set. You know, that type of thing. Like, Matt, you have your Valduk deck from Dominaria, but it would have been very, very hard for you to also build like Muldrotha and Evra and stuff like that.
I mean, unless you're Brian Canada with Cure for the Common Game, who has a deck for every single deck out there, every single legendary out there. Not an envious spot. I mean, kudos to you, Brian, but man, I don't know how you do it.
Yeah. Dana, do you have any quick thoughts about the ideas of creative capital? Is this a thing that you've run into? Do you feel that as a pressure on yourself as well? Or, I don't know, before we even actually get into any numbers on a set-by-set basis, I'm just curious what your experience is with this, where your deck building energy feels like it has the ability to go.
I don't have any problems with this, in part because I very rarely build a deck unless the commander's been out for a year or two.
This is a good point, actually.
Yeah, I mean, and that's intentional. Like, I just want to wait, and I like to build commanders that don't see a ton of play, so I want to wait and let them sit for a while and see if they don't see a ton of play before I even look at them in the first place. So I never feel like I see that new commander out and like, I really want to brew this. I just don't have that urge. I might file it away for later, but like, this is something that really doesn't plague me because of the way I tend to brew. But I completely understand how it's a thing for people, because you routinely on Twitter, whenever a new set comes out, see someone like, I want to build this and this and this. And I'm like, that's a lot to have to deal with right away. It's enough work alone just to make cuts for the new cards you find for existing decks, let alone to want to brew 2 or 3 decks out of every set. That's insane.
Yeah, if you want to build multiple decks from every single set that comes along these days, you're taking on a lot. And man,
yes,
kudos to you.
It does sound to me a little bit, though, Dana, like maybe you actually, it's not necessarily that creative capital and the deck building bandwidth or whatever. The way that you described it actually sounds like you just have very, very, very small amounts of creative capital to spend, is actually because of how long it takes, maybe? Is that too much of a read-in? Am I reading too closely?
No, because like it just hits me in different ways, because I'm trying to find a way to build a deck, generate with a commander that isn't super popular, and I'm usually trying to build a deck that doesn't play in a similar way to a deck I currently have.
Right.
Which the more decks you have becomes more and more difficult to do. So yeah, I mean, like every new deck I build becomes more and more challenging for that reason.
Well, I would say that your creative capital, as it were, then it's not so much put onto the sets and the commanders themselves, but what is going on with your current suite of decks, and how can you do something new to offer and expand on that? It sounds like yours isn't so much when a new card is previewed. That's fine and dandy for you, but where does it fit in everything else you're already doing?
Yes.
And especially what I think is so important about this type of analysis now is that, you know, we've gotten so many more legendary creatures in recent sets. A whole bunch of sets are having like 15 plus, sometimes up to 20, sometimes 25 legendary creatures per set. And if the amount of creative capital that players still have, if your deck building bandwidth is still kind of at that 1 deck per set base, then that has an interesting effect on the other legendary creatures that could come out in those various sets. And that is just a really interesting thing to look into. And we kind of wanted to examine what it is that players are doing, how players are responding to all of those big forces of getting tons and tons of products that also contain tons upon tons upon tons of new commanders all of the time. Real fast, this is a fun moment that I think will sort of help orientate us a little bit for what the rest of the show is going to look like. I was very curious about the, I'm calling this the big one, the big measurement, because at the current time of recording, there are 629,203 decks in the EDHREC database, and there are roughly 1,200 commanders in the format. This is a very rough amount because partners make this a very difficult thing to measure exactly, but I was curious how many of the top commanders make up 50% of that 600,000 figure. Like if you were to cut the format in half and balance it on a scale, how many commanders would end up on each side of the most popular and the least popular of those 1,200 commanders? And real quick, Matt, do you think you had a guess before you found out what the figure was? Would you have expected it to be pretty even or really lopsided? I'm just really curious.
Well, as a good student does, I did my homework 5 minutes before it was due. So I've not seen this note, but in all seriousness, we did talk about this a little bit, so I intentionally have not looked at this note yet.
Okay.
So taking into consideration, like, the thousands of commanders, probably, well, not thousands, hundreds, I should say, because you just said there's 1,200 total commanders. The hundreds of commanders with 1 or 2 decks, anything like that. I would say there's probably 150 to 200 is going to be my, like, off the brain guess, because once I mean, even when you're in the top 100 that you can see on EDHREC, there's still quite a few decks for all those commanders. So I would say 150 as a low number.
All right, so roughly you're expecting the top 150 commanders make up just as many decks as the rest of the commanders in the format.
Yeah, slightly more than 10% of the commanders take up half of the total decks.
And Dana, where would your estimate have fallen? Maybe you did cheat on the homework.
I did cheat on the homework. I know the answer. Okay. But I know what my guess would have been, and my guess would have been probably around 60 to 70.
It's so funny to hear that, because indeed, y'all split the difference pretty evenly.
Okay.
The answer is 101, from Kenrith at the #1 spot all the way down to Xenagos, God of Revels, at spot 101. The top 101 commanders combine to a total of 313,234 decks, which is approximately half to that 600,000 figure that we saw earlier. So again, the top 101 commanders in the format have just as many decks as the remaining approximately 1,100 commanders in the format. To put this another way, that is roughly 8% of the legends in Commander make up 50% of the deck building energy in the format. I feel like this is Kuka Banana Pants. That is the official analysis term, is a little bit cuckoo. But that seems really interesting to me, to see just how popular is. Like, Matt, does that number surprise you when you hear it?
No, not at all. I mean, hearing the explanation and then kind of thinking back on it, I mean, I did kind of in my answer mention like the top 100-ish commanders that we can see. So I was right. I was closer than Dana. So I win.
I don't know if that's true. He said like 70. He was like only 30 off, and you were 50 off. I
did say like when you think about the top 100, that was in my ramblings.
I think Price is Right rules are in effect here, Matt. I think
that's going over. Okay. You know what, Bob Barker, just hush down.
But no, I just think that's so interesting to see just how lopsided some of this deck building energy is, that those titans of the format really are the titans of the format. You know, the Kenriths and the Corvolds and all of those at the very tip top really do, like, we see a lot of those big names occupying quite a lot of the deck building space, which is, I mean, Dana, for you, it's got to be very, very interesting, if not difficult, because I know how much you want to avoid anything that is popular to any degree.
It's gotten easier when they started printing 150 commanders per year. Way simpler than it was back when we'd get, 15. So that's definitely made my life easier, I think. But I do think definitely, like, if you go into your average LGS, I would say, on Commander night, and there's, 20 to 30 people playing, I guess Golos is gone now, but like once upon a time, there'd have been 3 or 4 Golos decks going, and a couple of Kenrith decks, and a couple of Eureka decks. And I do feel like, generally speaking, those top, 20 commanders very heavily dominated the public playing space out there in the wild, so to speak. I guess I didn't know how to kind of quantify that, and apparently that just means the top 100, take up a lot of the space, and not the top 50 or 60 or 70. But I definitely was not surprised to see how heavily represented those popular commanders were.
Yeah, I mean, even comparing to my anecdotal evidence, kind of like what Dana mentioned, I mean, looking back, it was like, oh yeah, I've seen 10 Atraxa decks out there for every, oh, hey, cool, the Mean and Den Wildborn deck. Like, that's pretty cool to see. You don't see that very often. That absolutely kind of rings true. And the more that I'm kind of processing this here, the more I believe the numbers, even though, yeah, I should believe the numbers because they're actually there.
Well, and so that is just it as well, is that I think we do need to take that figure with a pretty decent grain of salt, because EDHREC does not have perfect data. It's impossible to have perfect data. The overwhelming majority of Commander players do not put their deck lists online, and that is a thing to be very cognizant of as we look at more figures in this episode. So, Matt, that makes me want to pitch this question back to you with that understanding or that framework now. Do you think that this disparity, if we were to extrapolate it out to all of the decks that we can't actually measure, do you think that this disparity is even more severe, or do you think it's actually more even? What would you expect?
It's hard to tell, really, because at some point the data that we are able to see and then we display back, we're only showing information that we are getting from the deck building websites out there, like MTG Goldfish, Archidect, Moxfield, all those sites that we do get information from. We're only repeating that back and kind of translating it for everyone to see. So the information that we're getting is just the best that's available. You are absolutely correct. It is not perfect data. It is not entirely representative by any means. It's just the best that we're working with. At the same time, it almost becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy where people see the numbers and so they just repeat the numbers. So I think it's a little bit of both, really, that it is not and it is representative. And I know that's kind of impossible to do, but yeah, I think depending on kind of your play group, what the shops are like at your any given area, it could be doing either or.
Yep.
And Dana, I'm going to throw the question back to you. Do you think that this problem is like bigger in the real life? Like, do you think that Kenrith is actually, there are tens upon millions of Kenrith decks that we're not seeing? Like, I don't know, that's a very obvious exaggeration, but like, do you think that the disparity is bigger in the stuff we can't see? Or is this, where are you at with it? I'll just throw the question to you.
Yeah, my guess is the popular commanders are probably even more popular among the underrepresented players. At least based on my experience with those kind of kitchen table only people, they tend to, and again, this is in my experience, not pay attention to the precise things in the 99. They're not necessarily looking to see what's better than Manolith. They are just filling their deck with the cards they have, but they tend to be more purposeful about the commanders they pick. And they do see that shiny Kenrith and that shiny Muldrotha and that shiny Atraxa. Like, they see those splashy commanders that do strong, powerful things. And maybe they don't fill the deck with the same cards that entrenched players do, but they do like their commanders to be heavy hitters. So I would guess out there in the wild, we see the same thing we see. And it's probably more heavily skewed towards that because they're also probably not digging deep because they're just not entrenched players. So they're not finding those old legends. They're just building the new big ones that they see from recent sets that are quite popular.
Well, and to build off of that too, with the increase in power of the pre-constructed decks and how great they are as a tool for getting players into the format, I would say some of those very powerful commanders that we're seeing in those precons, they're absolutely probably out there more often than we're even seeing on the website because they're just buying a precon, they're putting in the commander they think is the best, and then rolling with that, and they've never even heard of Moxfield. I think that absolutely is the case, yeah. So yeah, some of the most popular commanders, like that top 1%, they might be even more represented out there.
Yeah, that is, I think, where Eileen is as well. But, it's tough to say exactly. It's tough to draw specifically. But, that was just one of several figures that I think we can look into. And I think it would be interesting for us now to turn our attention to sort of on a set-by-set basis, doing that same, how many of the top control 50% of the deck building energy, only on a more set-by-set case basis, which could be pretty interesting to see, especially through that framework of where does the deck building energy go? Where is that creative capital being spent? Especially as there are sets upon sets upon sets that are all released right next to each other. So let's examine some recent sets and maybe a few old ones to see what we feel about it. I guess starting with Crimson Vow. This is the most recent set that we're seeing, full of vampires and a whole bunch of stuff, but there are 23 legends in Crimson Vow, and let's get right to the numbers. I guess we're just going to dive right in. There are about 5,000 decks total to Crimson Vow so far at the time of recording, and looking through it, the top 4 most popular commanders from Crimson Vow, Toxrill, Runo, Umbris, and Grolnok, they approximately make up half of the deck building energy out of all of the commanders from Crimson Vow. So 4 out of the 23 commanders, like, that's pretty crazy to me. The top 4 commanders from Crimson Vow have just as many decks as the other 19.
Well, and that number gets even more steep because the difference between the number 4 and the number 5 commanders in the set isn't all that many. But because it is the 4 that make up half, like, that's still strong enough to really show off that point. because yeah, the drop off gets very steep very quickly with these commanders. And like Joey said, it's fairly early in the deck building cycle for Crimson Vow, so these numbers might fluctuate a little bit. But so far, I mean, Toxtrol the Corrosive is the most built commander, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
It could be. I don't know. I feel like Toxtrol's such a weird thing to play against. I would love for Runo to the Mr. Stromkirk man who see creatures in Dimir. Like I would love for him to overtake Toxtrol. That's just me. I have no goodwill towards the slug, but that's just me. I do think it's really interesting here that right off the bat we are seeing 3 Dimir commanders at the top of Crimson Vow. Like, the Umbrus, Runo, and Toxtrol are the 3 most popular commanders from Crimson Vow. That's 3 Dimir commanders in a row, and they're leaving the rest kind of in the dust. And I think that's just a fascinating thing to observe when it comes to creative capital.
So we talked about this a little bit an episode or 2 back, things we're thankful for. We mentioned how we like the interesting Rakdos commanders we've gotten this year. If you would have asked me earlier this year, like what color pairings had the least amount of interesting commanders, I would have said Rakdos, Dimir, and Boros. I feel like there's been an effort made this calendar year to give us an interesting, diverse spread of Dimir commanders, which we're seeing this year, of Rakdos commanders, which we've seen throughout the course of the year when we talked about on our Thankful show, and giving us Boros equipment commanders, which we've seen all year.
That we've seen all decade.
Yeah, right. So I think that's what we're seeing here a little bit, though. Like I think there was an attempt, it feels like, to find some different types of Dimir commanders, things that were not typically what we've seen in the past, and they've been successful as far as we can tell. Players have jumped at the chance to build something a little outside that Dimir box, and we're seeing 3 of them right here.
Well, and it's not just Crimson Vow. Wilhelt the Rotcleaver came out in the set right before this one, and that one was also Dimir. And Wilhelt is the runaway favorite from Midnight Hunt. So, in fact, let's go ahead and turn our attention from Crimson Vow to the set that came like a month and a half right before it, talking about creative deck building energy and how much of it you've actually got to build. Let's look at some numbers from Midnight Hunt now. There were 17 total commanders, 17 legendary creatures that came out of the Midnight Hunt stuff. And out of the 17 commanders, just 2 of them make up half of that deck building energy. Wilhelt the Rotcleaver and Tovolar the Werewolf Dire Overlord guy. They make up approximately half of the decks, of the 10,000 decks total that have been built from Midnight Hunt. It is approximate. It is not exactly half. It is as close to half as we can actually get when measuring things out. So, note that for sure. But that's also really interesting. The Dimir commanders that we saw are runaways from Crimson Vow, and there's also a Dimir commander that's leading the charge in Midnight Hunt because, well, the zombie infection, it got me too. Wilhelt has been one of my favorite decks I've ever, it's so much fun. So I guess I do get it. I do understand. The Dimir infection has also seized me. Yeah,
this set is probably the most egregious when it comes to there's 2 heavy hitters and the rest just kind of fall by the wayside. And Wilhelt, I should note, Joey, isn't running away with it in a landslide. It's a 10% difference between Tovolar and Wilhelt, but it is absolutely those 2 are the only 2 that are really, anything to write home about, because the drop off is massive after Tovolar. But yeah, everything else kind of falls out. And one thing that kind of stands out is there are some big names in the lore that are in both of these sets. Innistrad is kind of well known for having a lot of lore behind it.
Yeah.
But Olivia, Crimson Bride, only 347 decks so far. You had Old Stick Fingers, which was kind of the meme commander that everybody was talking about. There's only 577 decks right now for Midnight Hunt. And I just... That's kind of crazy that even though people seemed very, very excited coming out of the gates, that creative capital didn't last and it didn't translate into decks being built.
I think Lind is another great example as well. The Curse commander, Lind Cheerful Tormentor, she is part of that big drop off that you mentioned, where the second place commander from Midnight Hunt has 2,300 decks. And then the third place commander, Lind, has 1,000. That's a pretty steep drop off. And Curse commander, heck yeah, we've always wanted that kind of thing. And it's still not quite as much of an appeal as the other things. And that is what I think is so interesting. If you've been clamoring for a werewolf commander for a really long time, and you kind of only have the capital to actually build 1 deck per set, well, when Midnight Hunt comes out, you want to build that werewolf deck, and that's where all of your energy goes to. But if you also were interested in building curses, it might be harder. Like, even though they are both really exciting commanders to you, it might end up being hard to justify building both of those things in one set. That isn't going to be as realistic for every player out there. Imagine if you also like zombies. I mean, building all 3 of those commanders from one set, it just seems like a whole lot. So I just think it's so fascinating how interesting commanders can overshadow each other just by dint of when they were released together.
I also wouldn't be surprised if we don't see a ton of changes to any of these lists. You know, looking at the Midnight Hunt set, Tovolar and Lind in the 2 and 3 slot, like, we may well not see any new werewolves that inspire someone to build a Tovolar deck for the next several years, possibly. Same thing with Lind and Curses. You know, people tend to build a new commander deck when there are cards in the deck that inspire you to build it. We're just probably not going to see anything that's going to make anyone build that Tovolar deck or that Lind deck until we get back to Innistrad, possibly. Whereas with Wilhelt, we almost always get new zombie cards, that kind of thing. So I think this list is going to maintain stasis moving forward with Wilhelt continuing to get built, and we probably won't see a ton of new Tovolar or Lind decks, probably, I'm guessing, in the fairly near future.
Dana, I really hope this list does not pay the 1 blue every single turn. That stasis just needs to get broken.
Oh, that's
a Stacks joke.
Well, and I think also, like, looking at those 2 sets, which are basically back to back, this is also sort of a phenomenon that we can kind of see about, like, maybe those sets competing with each other a little bit. I don't know if it's a ton, but, like, again, there's kind of this relentlessness to the products being, like, constantly one right after another, and, like, players sometimes begging for a reprieve online. But I feel like we might even feel this even greater when we look at sets that are also released alongside pre-con sets, because that is when the numbers get especially interesting. I'll actually start with, if we're moving along through the timeline, let's go to Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, and let's actually start with the precons. The Adventures in the Forgotten Realms precons, which contained commanders like Prosper and Sephirus of the Hidden Ways. When we look at the 12 total legendary creatures that came out of those precons, what we see is that 2 of those commanders have just as many decks as the other 10 commanders from that set. So, you know, the top 2 commanders approximately reach about half of the 10,000 decks that came out of the Legends from the AFR precons. Prosper in a definitely, Matt, this one is a runaway favorite lead, and Gallia, Kindler of Hope combined to make roughly the same amount of decks as the other half of, as the rest of the other 10 commanders from that set. I just think that's really, really interesting to see. And again, that's as close to half as it can be based on, you know, how many decks each one of them has. But that is not nearly as interesting to me as the effect that I think it has on the main set, because there are 10,000 decks that came out of the precon commanders from that set. But when we look at the actual Adventures in the Forgotten Realms set, not the precons, there are only 3,000 decks that have been built out of the commanders from the main AFR set. That feels like a huge overshadowing to me. That feels like a creative capital nightmare.
I think that has more to do with none of the legends from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms were particularly exciting. I don't recall seeing a whole lot of folks really jazzed about too many of those, whereas the precons, obviously, yeah, there's more Prosper decks out there than there are total decks with commanders from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. So if you want to talk about like one commander even overshadowing an entire set, you have it right here.
I wouldn't say they weren't exciting necessarily, but I would say that this definitely felt like it was a step back in power, particularly from Strixhaven, the set right before it.
Sure.
So I wonder how much of that was a result of us getting a ton of legends in Strixhaven that people maybe wanted to build because there were a lot of really splashy, interesting ones. And then we moved to AFR, where the power level was definitely ratcheted back a notch. I think that might have led to people combining both being burnt out and having spent a bunch of creative capital on the previous set, and then also looking at these that were not necessarily that obviously powerful and just deciding to take a couple months off when it came to brewing.
And maybe saying that they weren't exciting isn't the right term. They were a little narrow.
Sure,
they were a little focused on doing adventure stuff or, going in the adventuring in the dungeon, anything like that. So yeah, they might have been a little too specific. Prosper is fairly specific. Like you would want to be doing all the treasures and casting things from exile. But even then, like that was something that folks have been kind of asking for with interesting Rakdos commanders. So yeah, saying that they weren't exciting was maybe a little misworded on my part.
And especially like, you know, because Matt, this is the set that had Dritzduorden, that one, which I pronounced correctly. Thank you very much.
It sounds like a mosquito hitting one of those neon lights.
Can you tell that we don't play?
We don't play Forgotten Realms. Yep.
Right. But that was certainly like one of the big names to come out of that set. And even that one is really far down the list. It only currently at time of recording has 268 decks to its name, Dritzduorden. Like I think that's very fascinating to see. It's, you know, Dritzduorden has fewer decks than the Brunor Battlehammer, the Boros equipment. Really? Like that is right. That's weird. I feel like that's really strange. So yeah, I think that this is a good thing to note, is that the excitement or the creative, where the juices sort of get flowing and where you want to start brewing and stuff, it does definitely feel like a lot of the pre-con commanders had more exciting things that would appeal more to a commander player, for sure. I'm super willing to cede that point, absolutely. But I just do think that it is interesting when we see that the pre-con release right along the main set did have a pretty significant impact on how many decks are being built from AFR. I feel like there's a non-zero amount that is certainly impacting that compared to when pre-con sets are not released right next to sets. Like I just feel like that is a thing worth noting.
It's definitely interesting, and I'll be curious to see if this is a trend that holds up when we look at other sets down the road.
Well, Dana, that almost sounds like we should be looking at some other sets down the road.
Absolutely.
But I think we might actually need to not do that yet, because I think what we actually ought to do at this moment in time is perhaps challenge some stats. Is that a thing we should do?
Only if we're challenging stats when it's like sponsored by altersleeves.com/EDHRECast. Because everybody knows you can go to Altersleeves and get awesome inner sleeves to protect your cards. But also the cool thing about it, they don't damage your cards because somebody's writing on them or putting different art on them. They're just actually just going right over the current art that you already have on there, just adding some interesting, unique kind of ways to customize your cards. And it's great. And like I said, it protects them, and you should be double sleeving your cards because, oh, that shuffle feels so satisfying. So yeah, altersleeves.com/EDHRECast. That's how you challenge the stats properly, Joey.
I appreciate you. Thank you. I am the master of segues. You can tell it was not forced whatsoever when I made that segue. So I appreciate you mastering the segue. All right. Real quick. Yes, this is Challenge the Stats. This is one of our favorite features on the show because there's so much data on EDHREC, but we don't always agree with it. Sometimes we think that cards see too much or too little play. So let's take a break from those interesting creative capital deck building bandwidth numbers and talk a little bit about some individual cards that are seeing too much or too little play. Dana, how about you start us off this week? What is your challenge? The
first card was sent to us by John Prime, who you can find on Twitter at Hubstraker. And the card is Skyclave Shadow Cat. It's 3 in a black for a cat horror. It's a 3/3. And for 1 in a black, it says you can sacrifice another creature and put a +1 counter on Skyclave Shadow Cat. And whenever a creature you control with a +1 counter on it dies, you draw a card. This is currently in just over 1,100 decks on EDHREC, and John suggests that it should be in more +1 counter themed decks, particularly ones that feature Rayhan, Last of the Abzan in the command zone. And the main reason why here is one of the tricks people tend to like to do with Rayhan is be able to sacrifice a creature mid-combat so you can move those counters around, preferably onto Rayhan when it is either not blocked or when it's the optimal time to do that. The problem with a sack outlet like Ajnat Altar or something is the mana just goes away because you're in mid-combat. Skyclave Shadowcat lets you draw a card and put a counter on the Shadowcat, and you just gain advantage generally from a thing you were going to be doing anyway. It can get pretty big all on its own. It can be a good thing to sacrifice in some other way to move those counters around, and it's a good way to move the counters onto Rayhan and do those kind of shenanigans. So it's in just over 1,100 decks, and it can be a pretty effective card in that Rayhan deck. You probably should see a little more play.
I do appreciate some +1 counters that get moved around and some sacrifice outlets. That is a thing that I super do appreciate. So I think I could get on board with that pick. I'm going to move to my challenge now, which is actually a challenge for Prosper Tomebound, because I notice there's a bit of a misunderstanding that I've seen a couple of times with Prosper, and it's regarding the card Mizzix's Mastery. Mizzix's Mastery is that amazing red sorcery, 4 mana, but you can overload it for 8 mana, which is usually what people do with it, to exile all of the instants and sorceries from your graveyard, and then you make copies of all of those, and you can cast those copies. And that right there is the point of contention that I've seen be misunderstood a couple of times, and so I'm using my Challenge to Stats segment here to point out a kind of a non-bow, because the expectation that it looks like players are thinking they'll get from Mizzix's Mastery is that when it exiles all of those spells and casts a bunch of spells from your graveyard, they think that that will trigger Prosper a whole bunch of times, but that isn't actually the way that Mizzix's Mastery works. Mizzix's Mastery exile those cards and then creates a copy of them, and you cast the copies, but that doesn't necessarily count for Prosper's ability, so that is a non-bow that I wanted to point out here. Mizzix's Mastery, there is a bit of that isn't quite working with Prosper in the ways that folks might want it to, so that is a card to be a little bit skeptical of if that is something that you are looking for in your Prosper decks. Just make sure that you know how that interaction is actually working out.
Well, and Joey, I'll wrap this segment up then, since that's how we normally do it around these parts. So
our segues right now. Our
segues are just... they're almost as good as Omnath Locus of Creation, which is the commander that I'm going to talk about. So if you haven't heard, Omnath Locus of Creation is the 4-color, no black version of Omnath that came out in Zendikar Rising. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card that has about 8 paragraphs worth of landfall abilities. Basically, if you play 3 lands, you win the game. Not quite, but it's pretty dang close. So one card that all the players out there seem to be very excited about with Omnath Locus of Creation is the new card from Crimson Vow, Cultivator Colossus. Now, that card is very big, very splashy. It's a big green mythic. It's 7 mana for a plant beast with trample. Power and toughness equals the number of lands you control, and then when it enters battlefield, you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, and if you do, you draw a card and repeat this process. That's all well and good, but when the average deck is only playing 37 lands, more often than not, you might play a land and then draw a card, and that's about it. Cultivator Colossus is 7 mana, and with a lot of the ramp spells that you're playing in the typical Omnath Locus of Creation decks, you're pulling a lot of lands out of the deck, so you're not going to be able to chain all these lands together like a lot of players were originally hyped to do when you're only playing 37 lands on average. If you're playing upwards like 45-ish, you might have better chances, but the numbers there don't really justify Cultivator Colossus. But if you want a big beater that's going to be able to go to town on your opponents and also being able to get lands and feed itself, might I suggest the card Uvenwild Hydra, which is another Innistrad card, but back from the Shadows over Innistrad block. So Uvenwild Hydra is 4 and 2 green for a creature with reach, has power and toughness equal to number of lands you control, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a land card and put onto the battlefield tapped and shuffle your library. So this is a great way to get utility lands out of your library, get them in, whether you want that Valakut, that way you can start triggering all of your mountains, whether you need a utility land, anything like that. I'm a big fan of Uvenwild Hydra, and so while 48% of decks with Omnath at the helm that have updated their decks since Cultivator Colossus came out, they're putting Cultivator Colossus in there. Currently, Uvenwild Hydra, which has been out for a long time, not on the page at all. Turns out only 4% of Omnath Locus of Creation decks are playing Uvenwild Hydra. I think folks should be swapping those numbers around. If you're playing a very high number of lands, Cultivator Colossus, yes, can be a colossal just beat down. But Uvenwild Hydra, thank you, Joey. Uvenwild Hydra, I think, is going to give you so much more consistent value. You're going to get the specific land that you want, and also it's just a massive creature that's going to be able to bat down all those flyers. I love Uvenwild Hydra. Cultivator Colossus is a little hit or miss. I think folks should be making that swap.
Cultivator Colossus was such an interesting card to see previewed because it sparked that initial, this is absolutely busted, this is broken, what are we going to do, sky is falling type of mentality, and then it was like, the card's fine. That's kind of like...
It's fine. Yeah. It's real super duper okay.
Yeah, this is good, but I think you're right that it certainly needs a bit more building around, and 37 lands is a low land count for an average number of lands in a landfall deck. That's I'm bonus challenging on Matt's right there. 37 lands in an Omnath deck is way too few for an average number.
Yeah, even if you're Dana and you put Cultivator Colossus in your deck, you're gonna change the number of lands you're playing.
There you go. You hear that, Dana? That's what,
not the number of basics, though, right?
Not the number of basics. Never, never.
I'm fine.
You should never play more basics. No.
Dana's over here like, yeah, I'll play 2 times more basics.
Right.
He has 0 basics. So
Yeah.
it's still 0. Yeah. And also just Matt, I also love the Hydra pick too, because like that is a card that the more I see it, the more it does impress me. He's fetching any land. That is actually pretty cool. Like it's sort of subtly powerful in that way. Any folks who are a fan of MTG Mudsta's channel will probably have seen Ulvenwald Hydra do a whole lot of work. So shout out to Mudsta, because that is a cool card that I've certainly seen to great use on his channel, and seen used to great use in Matt Morgan's decks, where he obliterates me with an Ulvenwald Hydra, which has reach. I always forget that it has reach, Matt.
It does indeed have reach. And that's like one of those secretly great defensive abilities, kind of like Vigilance, where you never really think about it, but it's like, oh yeah, that card does get to stay around as a blocker. Oh yeah, that card does get to block my flyers. Oh yeah.
All right, guys, let's get back into our main topic here. Let's talk about players' creative bandwidth, deck building capital, whatever it is that we were calling it, the deck building energy that players have the ability to get to, and how it might be impacted by a whole bunch of products and a whole bunch of commanders all being released, all of that. Let's just take a look at some more numbers here. And I'm going to go to the Commander 2021 sets, because we had been talking about how precons might be affecting actual set releases earlier when we were talking about AFR. So let's examine the STRIXHAVEN Commander precons and the STRIXHAVEN set to see what's going on with those. So Commander 2021, there were 20 legendary creature options from Commander 2021. And this, of course, was the set that had such famous hits as Osgir the Reconstructor and Varen Voice of Duality. And when we look at the 17,000 decks that were created out of the Legends from Commander 2021, we see that 4 of those commanders make up approximately half of the decks that were built from Commander 2021. Osgir, Varen, Adrix and Nev, and Brina the Demagogue all combined to make roughly as many decks as the other 16 commanders from that Commander Precon set. Holy whoa.
One thing worth noting here is we did have a good separation among the color pairings. There's 1 Boros commander, 1 Izzet commander, 1 Simic commander, and 1 Orzhov commander. And if you go to number 5 on the list, Guillaume Master Chef, who's Golgari, we're continuing that separation. So that's kind of useful to see here, the fact that like people, they were not clumping up on one particular color pair, but they were spreading out what they actually found interesting.
Yeah. And especially, it doesn't seem like there was any one that got ignored, is maybe the word. And Matt, this is certainly a topic that's been of especially interest to you, I know, because you've noticed too that like when a whole bunch of deck building energy goes to like the big top commanders or something like that, then that kind of can leave some other interesting commanders by the wayside. And especially the interest is driven towards like multicolored commanders, or especially commanders that aren't mono white or stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I know you've been especially interested in how this effect of commanders overshadowing each other might sometimes cause colors to be left behind, and it doesn't seem like that's as much the case here.
Which is kind of awesome to see, actually. But then when you think back to what was going on in Commander 2021, the Lorehold deck was doing things that, you know, the red and white color combination hadn't really been doing too much before. So I'm not surprised at all when I see that Osgir is just kind of running away. Not quite running away, but, you know, has a significant lead over the second place commander from the set. And then even when you look down the line, like Alabu still has some respectable numbers among the rest of the list. I like what they did with this. And so seeing the even coverage, I think, shows just how well designed this Commander pre-constructed set was just overall. There's nothing super runaway. There were some very good things that were going on, some things that players were obviously very excited about, but nobody felt like they got left behind for once. Like there was no one deck that everybody wanted and then one deck that literally nobody cared about. You gave it to your little brother in their Christmas stocking.
Oh, wow. Oh, is that how you feel about your little brother, Matt? Is that the coal in the Christmas?
There's no what was the there's no Oloro
the Anya Merciless Archangel deck that was pawned off on the little sibling.
Oh no. Oh, you guys, I'm glad I'm not your little brother. Wow, y'all are savage. Y'all are savage pranksters to your siblings. Holy crap.
I will note here, talking about how I tend to not build decks, this is probably the one exception. I did build a commander deck out of a card in this set. I have a Tavash Gloom Summoner deck. So 4th from the bottom, but I did build a semi-new commander here.
a commander. I feel like I built like 2 from this set. Like this was a set that was actually so good that I feel like I did actually just like, oh, I want to build so many of these, but I didn't have the energy to build, in fact, all of these. But I love that your example of this actually broke through, and this made me definitely want to play all of the things and to build a whole bunch of decks. I built one. I love that that's your example, Dana.
Yes.
Oh, goodness. That is incredible. So here's also kind of I feel like a relevant question when it comes to just within the precons. How do you think reprint value might have affected numbers like this? Like we see that Osgir is the #1 commander from the 2021 precon set. I feel like the reprints in that deck were a bit of a mark above the other decks that we saw there. Do you think that influenced the numbers, that players were especially interested in getting those precons and then built the deck after getting that? They built that commander. Do you think that might have had an influence on these? Dana, yes or no?
It's hard to say. It's never influenced me. I have specifically sometimes picked a deck because a deck has more value than another one. But I don't know if it's ever made me want to keep it together. I've just like pulled the cards out I wanted.
Sure.
But that's me. So like I'm not going to try to apply that thinking to everyone else. It's possible. I wouldn't think that was the case. I would think the reason Osgir is so popular here is it's a strong Boros commander doing things that aren't necessarily what you usually see in Boros colors. That's a pretty good combination. Something unique and something strong in a color pair that usually doesn't have something strong. I think that's much more likely a driver than it is just good reprints.
Yeah, I think with the note that we made about the pre-constructed decks a couple minutes ago about the newer players are grabbing these pre-constructed decks and just running with them, I don't think they really care too much about reprint equity because they don't know what reprints even mean. So they're just grabbing these decks, they're playing them, they might stumble across, Architect and throw their list online.
Okay.
I think that's probably more likely to be happening than folks caring about the $5 difference between the Lorehold deck and the Izzet deck, or Prismari deck.
And so that's just it. What I wanted to say, Dana, you said Boros a couple of times now.
I did,
and we
yes.
We need to
Loros,
remind you.
And
it's Loros. This is STRIXHAVEN.
And I'm done. I'm done forcing.
This is STRIXHAVEN. Do you need to be sent to the principal's office, Dana?
I still call Commander EDH, so I guess that's just an old person thing.
Oh, goodness. Well, and so real quick, let's also focus in very briefly on the actual STRIXHAVEN set proper and see if things were majorly affected, minorly affected. What were, the effects that we see in the STRIXHAVEN main set? And here, there were 14 legendary creatures from the main STRIXHAVEN set, and 3 of those 14 control about half of the deck building energy there, them being Extus, Auric Overlord, Dina, Soul Steeper, and Cody, Vociferous Codex. And those 3 have just as many decks as the other 11 commanders from that set, and there are about 10,000 decks total, which is less than we see for Commander 21. I'm just curious if you guys have thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I'm actually a little surprised given how powerful STRIXHAVEN was kind of as a set and how many kind of odd, interesting commanders there were. I would have thought these numbers might be a little more balanced. But when you look at the commanders, Exodus was a very interesting commander that caught a lot of attention. #1 being kind of the only 3-color thing you could do in that set. And it was a strange, unique, and it was also pretty powerful. Dina being just a combo machine right in the command zone.
Oh, yeah.
And then Cody seeing a lot of competitive play. I think there's logical reasons those 3 were all very powerful or all very popular, I should say. I guess I can see why those have definitely risen to the top for sure.
Well, and two, like we talk about like the severe drop off. The #4 commander, Beladros Witherbloom, has very respectable numbers, almost 1,500 decks, only about 100 or so behind Cody. But after that, the numbers just start to plummet, where you have a lot of commanders that just aren't being played, just not terribly popular, with only like a couple hundred maybe to their name. So you start really seeing those numbers that we talked about at the beginning of the show, where like there's the cream of the crop, and then there's literally just like a mountain of other things.
And that's just it, because I feel like looking at those commanders, I feel like those commanders that are getting overlooked a little bit, that are plummeting in the numbers, I feel like those are still cream of the crop style commanders. Quintorius, Field Historian, is also an interesting Boros design that I feel like all of the other stuff going on has caused to be a little overshadowed. Killian Ink Duelist is really, really cool. And if it had been released in a different context, I think it wouldn't have been overshadowed here. But in this case, it does feel like it managed to be a bit overshadowed. And I feel this way about some of the cards from from the commander precons as well. There are just some very interesting cards that do, by dint of the way that they are released, seem to get overshadowed. And I just think that's an interesting note to take when it comes to the ways that cards are being designed and how they are packaged together and released when there are, 20 legends per set. Still, some of the interesting stuff just ends up falling through the cracks. And I think that's a little bit sad, and it makes me want to refocus my deck building energy as much as I possibly can, but man, is it hard.
I mean, so maybe, Joe, you can't answer this question quite as well as Dana can, but like you mentioned all those commanders in Strixhaven that like you feel got overlooked. Could you imagine like the problem Killian Ink Duelist would have been if it were released in 2011? Like back like when Rafiq of the Many was like an unbeatable commander. Like a lot of these commanders, like you're right, they are absolutely like cool things, but like they're coming out in an age where there are so many just other great designs that it's easy to overlook some otherwise very powerful things. Like cards that would, if they were been released even 5 years ago, would have stood out among the pack.
Honestly, Matt, that is kind of the lesson for me, as we're like sort of, we just went through a bunch of individual sets and we saw some individual numbers there. But to me, the thing to note is the trend that we see. An average of about 3 commanders from any given set tend to make up half of the deck building that gets done from that set. It does kind of vary, but generally when we look back on sets like Theros, or when we look back on Ikoria, or, even stuff like Jumpstart, like what we tend to see is between 2 and 4, but often 3, the top 3 commanders do tend to take up about half of the deck building energy. There are exceptions to this, some really big sets out there like Dominaria. If we were to look at those numbers, it would be a slightly higher, but it is still only like 5 or something like that. And Commander Legends is certainly its own big thing with 73 legendary creatures to build from, but also a whole bunch of partners that makes it especially tough to measure. But to me, like that is just the lesson that I think is so interesting here, is observing that trend where in any given set, a very small amount of the commanders tend to drive a whole lot of that stuff. And that means that the stuff that isn't, the non-top commanders, there tends to be a whole lot of them. And I just get sad if some of those commanders get overshadowed. But then again, maybe I shouldn't be too sad, because it does mean that deck builders like Dana will have a whole lot of hipster cred to cash in the future. Isn't that right, man? I
mean, yeah, like you joke about that, but like that is very much the case. And not even necessarily if you are someone who's consciously aware of that, maybe, but thinking back to 7 years-ish ago, where a core set would come out and would have 5 monocolor legends in it, and that was it. And 3 of them weren't any good. Like if you wanted to build a new deck and you were like feeling that itch, you didn't have very many options to begin with, and there was a very good chance that in your shop, 6 other people would build the same legend. Like that wasn't maybe very fun to build the same deck everyone else was building. Whereas today, when we're seeing 25 options per set, even if the top couple of them are very powerful or very popular, there's still plenty of choices for you to dig through to find something that appeals to you, and maybe appeals to you and also isn't something you're going to see a bunch being played around you. So it is, overwhelming, but it's also probably a good thing, I think, more often than not for people to just have this many choices.
Yeah, if you want to have a hipster type commander like Dana does, you don't have to be playing, like Kong Ming or some P3K legend. Like you have powerful options there, or at least like open-ended, and you can interpret them different ways type of commanders too. Like they're not just very narrow type of things doing only one thing, and even then they're not doing it very well. So yeah, it's kind of the rising tides type of thing where like all ships are going up.
Yeah.
Everybody's benefiting from it. It's great. So
yeah, I think that's a lesson I can get on board with. It does feel a lot like an avalanche, but we do also still get those feelings of, I've never seen that commander before, because there are just indeed so many options to choose from. But for me, at least, like I had a whole bunch of fun building Wilhelt this year, and Wilhelt is the #1 commander from Midnight Hunt. And it was such like, oh man, it was a revelation playing that deck. I loved it so much, but especially looking over to see just how popular actually is, and to see sometimes the disparity that can happen between the most popular commanders and the ones that they don't get left behind necessarily, but like I do see those, and it makes me want to lean a little bit more into acknowledging we're trying to build around some of those commanders that don't get nearly as much attention. And I guess, Dana, it's kind of winning me over to the style that you build, but I am probably going to resist waiting the full 2 years like you tend to do before you build anything. I think that is my lesson here, ? I think. Yeah. Sounds like it could be a good lesson.
Well, we've met halfway, Joey, because clearly I built a commander that wasn't 2 years old this year as well. So we're both impacting each other here, apparently.
There you go. That right there is the best lesson. I love it. With that, I do think that we should probably call this episode to a close. There were a whole bunch of numbers. Listeners, we would love to hear what you think about the stuff that we've gone over today and what you think about that big grand total at the beginning that we mentioned where 8% of the commanders in the format control 50% of the commander deck building energy out there. What do you think of that? And maybe what are some of your favorite commanders that came out in the past year that you feel might be getting a little overlooked? We would really love to hear from you. And fellas, if our listeners want to get in touch with us specifically, where is it that they can find us all? Matt?
So you can find me on the Twitters at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, Wednesday evenings we are streaming over at twitch.tv/EDHRECast, where we have some awesome guests on every single week, and the games are always a ton of fun. So make sure you tune in because it's always a blast.
Indeed. And Dana?
You can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can hear me on my other podcast, CMDR Central. I am writing articles for both EDH Rec and for Commander's Herald, and you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me at Joseph M. Schultz on Twitter, and you can find the cast at EDHRECast on Facebook and on Twitter as well. Plus, if you've got a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Our thanks go out once again to the whole team at the Command Zone for handling the post-production work on the podcast, and we want to thank our sponsors, TCG Player and CardKingdom.com. And you can visit altersleeves.com/EDHRECast for cool custom EDHREC sleeves. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights, but until then, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.